Hey there, young historians. How are you? I've got a couple things to talk about today. First, I just want to mention this distance learning thing that we've been on. This, journey through school together separately, where we've all been in our own homes, still trying to learn together, and it's been challenging for sure. But I commend you on working hard for these 37 days we've already been doing this, and I commend you on putting in the effort. It's easy to just shut down, but you are showing some fortitude in keeping it going. We've just got 5 or 6 days left, and I, like you, am looking towards summer, but we have work to finish. And so I ask you to focus and finish out the year strong, reflect on and look back on this distance learning, and then look to summer. So that's where we are right now. Thank you, and let's keep it going. Let's finish up this hard work. Second, we are on our last unit, our last topic of study. And this topic of study is a challenging one for a couple of reasons. First reason is it does not have a clear ending. It's not like World War II where you're like, oh, I know exactly when that ended, 1945. We even know the day, the month and day. Or even the Cold War, where we know that Cold War, a 45-year conflict, had a pretty clear ending. This one doesn't have a clear ending. It's not so cut and dry. The other reason that this is difficult is because it impacts us today. It impacts us differently, and I really need for us to realize that you may think this isn't really about you, it's about somebody else, but really it is about you, it's about me, it's about all of us. So the topic and time period that I'm talking about is called the Civil Rights Era, or the Civil Rights Movement. And civil rights are, it's pretty easy. Civil rights are just rights that we all get because we are born as humans. That's it. Your rights that are granted to you because you were born as a human. These civil rights are rights like the freedom to life and liberty, prosperity, the rights to free speech, but also like the rights that a lot of us enjoy and some other people don't enjoy. So the Civil Rights Era is all about a group of people, and we're going to talk about this specific group, who are fighting for those rights. And they're not fighting for a better life than others. They're not asking for more. They're just asking for what is provided in the term civil rights and equal rights, just to be treated equally. So the Civil Rights Era specifically is about African Americans. And you might go, African American rights? We've talked about this already, Mr. Huggins. I remember when we had slavery and we talked about slavery and then slavery ended. And that should have been, freedom and, and equal rights then for African Americans. No. And I don't think a lot of you were thinking that, because I think a lot of you remember that even after slavery, life was still tough for African Americans. We then looked at the Reconstruction Era. And for 10 years, we discussed how the Reconstruction Era was trying to grant, or we were trying to decide whether African Americans were moving closer to full citizenship or further away from it. And as we went through those years and those events, we saw African Americans get closer and closer to full citizenship, but then a reversal happened, and they moved back closer to the system of slavery. And then in the 1880s and 90s and 1900s, we didn't really talk much about it. And it might have just seemed like, oh, it went away. Things got better. But then we saw in the 1920s a rise in the Ku Klux Klan once again. And we saw that prejudice and racism and discrimination, it still existed in the 1920s. And then in the 1940s, we saw World War II happen. And, we talked about how, African Americans fought in the war, and they were serving the country, and they were fighting to, help Americans and make sacrifices, while back home in their own country, they were not being granted those equal rights, and they were not being treated as fair or as equal. And then after World War II, we might go, okay, well, now things had to have gotten better, right? Well, in the 1960s, we then see the Civil Rights Era, where African Americans and some white allies continue to fight and push and protest, and most times do so peacefully, to make sure that African Americans did finally realize those civil rights. And they made progress, but it was not done. Because the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s and 2000s and 2010s and even all the way up until May of 2020, the month we are in right now, civil rights have still not been fully realized by all African Americans. We still see racism, and we still see discrimination. We still see prejudice. It is not over. There's no end because it's still existing right now. And if you go and look in the news right now, if you go and look on the internet and you look on television, you're going to see examples of this injustice. You're going to see examples of how this racism and prejudice and discrimination still exists. Dr. King, you've heard of him. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a major part of this civil rights movement. And he stood right on these steps right here in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he gave a speech called the I Have a Dream speech. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. You've heard of this before. So I'm going to quote Dr. King here. He said, "An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." What he means is, when you see an injustice, when you see a wrong, when you see somebody being treated as less than human, or as a second-rate citizen, or being treated unfairly, and you might say, well, that's somebody else. I don't need to worry about that. That's not me. That's them over there. They can deal with it on their own. An injustice over there is a threat to justice over here. If people are being treated unfairly over there, that is a threat to how your life is affected as well. An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. By the way, I've moved over here to the Dr. King Memorial, which is also in Washington, D.C. You can see the comparison in the size of a human to the statue. It is an impressive statue. I hope that you all get to see it someday. So, anyways, as we talk about the civil rights era, what I'm going to ask of you is to try to look at this from a perspective of humanity. What is right and what is wrong for humans? I want you to look at these events and imagine if this was happening to you and how you would feel if you were being treated in this way. That's what the civil rights era is all about. It's all about us as humans and how we treat each other. And so I plead with you to think about it that way. I ask you, as we're looking through the civil rights era, to be good, to be kind, to be well, and to be thoughtful. Reflect on your life, reflect on those around you, and make a decision of what kind of person you want to be, what kind of country you want to live in, what kind of a state and city and community and neighborhood you want to live in. And as Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change that you wish to see. Okay? Take care, everybody. Peace.